Chapter 16 of Ravensdene Court by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pathless Wood. Being very late in the evening when I arrived at Alnwick, I remained there for the night, and it was not until noon of the next day that I once more reached Ravensdene Court. Lorrimore was there, he had come over to lunch, and for the moment I hoped he had brought some news from his Chinese servant. But he had heard nothing of Wing since his departure. It would scarcely be Wing's method, he said, to communicate with him by letter. When he had anything to tell, he would either return or act of his own initiative upon his acquired information. The way of the Chinaman, he remarked, with a knowing look at Mr. Raven, was dark, subtle, and not easily understandable to Western minds. "And yourself, Middlebrook?" asked Mr. Raven. "What did the detective want, and what have you found out?" I told them the whole story as we sat at lunch. They were all deeply absorbed, but no one so much as Mr. Cazalet, who, true to his principle of doing no more than crumbling a dry biscuit and sipping a glass or two of sherry at that hour, gave my tale of the doings at Blyth and Hull his undivided attention. And when he had heard me out, he slipped away in silence, evidently very thoughtful, and disappeared into the library. "So there it all is," I said in conclusion, "and if anybody can make head or tail of it and get a definite and dependable theory, I am sure that Scarterfield, from a professional standpoint, will be glad to hear whatever can be said." "It seems to me that Scarterfield is on the high road to a very respectable theory already," remarked Lorrimore. "So are you. The thing, to me, appears to be fairly plain. It starts out with the association of Baxter and the dishonest bank manager. The bank manager, left in charge of this old-fashioned bank at Blyth, where any supervision of his doings was no doubt pretty slack, and where he was, of course, fully trusted, examines the nature of the various matters committed to his care, and finds out the contents of those forest-burnt chests. He then enters into a conspiracy with Baxter for purloining them and some other valuables, those jewels you mentioned, Middlebrook. It would not be a difficult thing to get them away from the bank premises without anyone knowing. Then the two conspirators secrete them in a safe and unlikely place, easily accessible, I take it, from the sea. Probably they meant to remove them for good and all, just before the dishonest bank manager's temporary residence in the town came to an end. But his fatal accident occurs. Then Master Baxter is placed in a nice fix. He knows that his fellow criminal's sudden death will necessarily lead to some examination more or less thorough of the effects at the bank. That examination, to be sure, was made, but Baxter has gone, cleared out, vanished, before the result is known. He may have had an idea, we can only guess at it, that suspicion would fall on him. Anyway, he leaves the town and is never seen in or near it again. If this theory is the true one, things seem pretty clear up to this point." "Of course," said I, "it is theory all supposition, you know." "Right," assented Lorrimore. "But let us theorise a bit further. I am, you see, merely following out the train of thought which seems to have been set up in you and in Scarterfield. Baxter disappears. Nobody knows where he's gone. There is a veil drawn over a certain period, pretty thickly. But we, who have had occasion to try to pierce it, have seen, so we think, through certain tears and rifts in it. We know that a certain number of years ago there was a trading ship in the Yellow Sea, the Elizabeth Robinson, concerning the fate of which there is more mystery than is quite in accordance with either safety or respectability. She was bound from Hong Kong to Chemulpo, and she never reached Chemulpo. But we also know that on her, when she left Hong Kong, there were two men, presumably brothers, whose names were Noah Quick and Salter Quick, set down, mind you, not as members of the crew, but as passengers. Also there was a Chinese cook of the name of Lo Chu Fen, and there was another man who called himself Netherfield, and who hailed from Blyth, in Northumberland." He looked round the table, evidently bent on securing our attention to their particular point. We were all, of course, fully acquainted with the details he was unfolding, but he was summing things up in quite judicial fashion, and there was a certain amount of intellectual satisfaction in listening to a succinct résumé. One of us, at any rate, was following with rapt attention Miss Raven. I fancied I saw why. Baxter, or Netherfield, had already presented himself to her as a personage of a dark and romantic, if deeply wicked and even blood-stained sort. "Now," continued Lorrimore, becoming more judicial than ever, "according to the official accounts as shown at Lloyd's, the Elizabeth Robinson never reached Chemulpo, and she is, officially, believed to have been lost with all hands during a typhoon in the Yellow Sea. All hands! But we know that whatever happened to the Elizabeth Robinson and to the rest of the crew, certain men who were on board her when she left Hong Kong for Chemulpo did escape whatever catastrophe occurred. The Elizabeth Robinson may be at the bottom of the Yellow Sea, and most of her folk with her. But in course of time Noah Quick turns up at Devonport, in England, in possession, evidently, of plenty of money. He takes a licensed house, runs it on highly respectable lines, and comports himself as a decent member of society. Also he prospers, and has a very good balance at his bankers. So there is one man who certainly did not go down with the Elizabeth Robinson. And now, to keep matters in chronological order, we hear of another. A Chinaman, undoubtedly Lo Chuh Fen, turns up at Lloyd's and endeavours to find out if this Elizabeth Robinson ever did reach Chemulpo. There is a strange point here. Lo Chuh Fen certainly sailed out of Hong Kong with the Elizabeth Robinson, bound for Chemulpo, yet some years later he is inquiring in London if the Elizabeth Robinson ever reached her destination. Why? Did the Elizabeth Robinson touch at any port after leaving Hong Kong? Did Lo Chuh Fen leave her at any such port? We don't know, and for the moment it is not material. What is material is that a second member of the company on board the Elizabeth Robinson did not go down with her in the Yellow Sea, if, as is said, she did go. So there are two survivors, Noah Quick and Lo Chuh Fen, and now a third is added in the person of another Quick, Salter, who turns up at Devonport as the guest of Noah, and who, like his brother, is evidently in possession of a plenitude of this world's goods. He has money in the bank, is a gentleman of leisure, and, like Noah, a person of reserved speech. Lorrimore was now fairly into his stride, and becoming absorbed in his summing up. He pushed aside his glass and other table impediments, and leaning forward spoke more earnestly, emphasizing his words with equally emphatic gestures. A person of reserved speech, he continued, but, on one occasion at any rate, so eager to get hold of information that he casts his habitual reserve aside. On a certain day in March of this year, Salter Quick, with a handsome amount of ready money in his pocket, leaves Devonport, saying that he is going away for a few days. We next hear of him at an hotel in Alnwick, where he is asking for information about certain churchyards on this Northumbrian coast, wherein he will find the graves of people of the name of Netherfield. The name of a man, be it remembered, who was with him and his brother Noah Quick on board the Elizabeth Robinson. Next morning he meets with Mr. Middlebrook on the headland between Alnmouth and Ravensdene Court, and, taking him for an inhabitant of these parts, he puts the same question to him. He accompanies Mr. Middlebrook to an inn on the cliffs, he asks the same question there, and there, evidently to his great discomfiture, he hears that another man, whose identity did not then appear, but who, we now know, was only a casual traveller who was merely repeating Salter Quick's own questions of the previous evening, which he had overheard at Alnwick, had been asking similar questions. Why had Salter Quick travelled all the way from Devonport to Northumberland to find the graves of some people named Netherfield? We don't know, but we do know that on the very night of the day on which he had asked his question of Mr. Middlebrook and of Claigue, the landlord, Salter Quick was murdered. And on that same night, at Devonport, 400 miles away, his brother, Noah Quick, met a similar fate. Mr. Cazalette came back into the room. He was carrying a couple of fat quarto books under one arm and a large folio under the other, and he looked as if he had many important things to communicate. But Miss Raven smilingly motioned him to be seated and silent, and Lorrimore, with a glance at him which a judge might have bestowed on some belated counsel who came tiptoeing into his court, went on. "Now," he said, "there were certain similarities in these two murders which lead to the supposition that, far apart as they were the work of a gang, working with common purpose. There was no robbery from the person in either instance, though each victim had money and valuables on him to a considerable amount. But each man had been searched. Pockets had been turned out, clothing ripped up. In the case of Salter Quick we are familiar with the details of the tobacco box, on the inner lid of which there was a roughly scratched plan of some place, and of the handkerchief bearing a monogram which Mr. Cazalette discovered near the scene of the murder. These are details of great importance, the true significance of which does not yet appear. But the real prime detail is the curious, mysterious connection between the name Netherfield, which Salter Quick was so anxious to find on gravestones in some Northumbrian churchyard or other, and the man of that name who was with him on the Elizabeth Robinson. And we are at once faced with the question, was the man, Netherfield Baxter, who left Blyth some years ago, the man Netherfield, described as of Blyth, whose name was on the Elizabeth Robinson's list? Mr. Raven treated us to one of his characteristic sniffs. He had a way, when he was stating what he considered to be a dead certainty, or when he was assenting to one, of throwing up his head and sniffing, with a somewhat cynical smile as accompaniment. He sniffed now, and Lorrimore went on to a peroration. "There can be no doubt about it," he said with emphasis. "A Blyth man, a seafarer, named Solomon Fish, chances to be in Hull, and, in a tavern there, which is evidently the resort of seafaring folk, sees a man whom he instantly recognises as Netherfield Baxter, whom he had known as a child, boy, and young man. He accosts him. The man denies it. We need pay no attention whatever to that denial. We may be quite sure from the testimony of Fish that the man is Baxter. Now then, what is Baxter doing? He is evidently in possession of ample funds. He and his companions buy a small vessel, a 20-ton yawl, in which, they said, they want to cross the North Sea to the Norwegian fjords. And who are his companions? One is a Chinaman, probably Lo Chuh Fen. The other is a Frenchman, who, says Mr. Jallanby, the Hull shipbroker, was addressed as Vicomte. He probably is an adventurer, and a criminous one, like Baxter, and he is also probably the owner of the handkerchief which Mr. Cazalette found, stained with Salter Quick's blood." Lorrimore paused a moment, looking round to see how this impressed us. The last suggestion was new to me, but I saw its reasonableness and nodded. Lorrimore nodded back and continued. "Now, a last word," he said. "I, personally, haven't a doubt that these three, one or other of 'em, murdered the Quicks, and that they're now going to take up that swag which Baxter and the dishonest bank manager safely planted somewhere. But I don't believe it's buried or secreted in any out-of-the-way place on the coast. I know where I should look for it, and where Scarterfield ought to search for it." "Where, then?" I exclaimed. "Well," he answered, "the thing is to consider what those fellows were likely to do with the old monastic plate, and the jewels and so on, when they'd got them. They probably knew that the ancient chalices, reliquaries, and that sort of thing would fetch big prices, sold privately to collectors, especially to American collectors, who, as everybody knows, are not at all squeamish or particular about the antecedents of property so long as they secure it. I should say that Baxter, acting for his partner in crime, stored these things and has waited for a favourable opportunity to resume possession of them. I incline to the opinion that he stored them at Hartlepool, or at Newcastle, or at South Shields, at any place where they could easily be transferred by ship. He may indeed have stored them at Liverpool, for easy transit across the Atlantic. I don't believe in the theory that they're planted in some hole and corner of the coast. In that case, what becomes of Salter Quick's search for the graves of the Netherfields? I suggested. Can't say, replied Lorrimore, with a shrug of his shoulders. But Salter Quick may have got hold of the wrong tale, or half a tale, or mixed things up. Anyway, that's my opinion, that this stolen property is not cached anywhere, but is somewhere within 4 respectable walls, and if I were Scarterfield, I should communicate with stores and repositories asking for information about goods left with them some time ago and not yet reclaimed. Good idea, agreed Mr. Raven. Much more likely than the buried treasure notion. To which, however, I incline, I said stubbornly. When Salter Quick sought for the graves of the Netherfields, he had a purpose. Mr. Cazalette came nearer to the table with his big volumes. It was very evident that he had made some discovery and was anxious to tell us of it. Before you go any further into that matter, said he, laying down his burdens, there are 1 or 2 things I should like to draw your attention to in connection with what Middlebrook told us before I left the room just a while since. Now, about that monastic plate, Middlebrook, of which you've seen the inventories. You may not be aware of it, but there's a reference to that matter in Dryman's History of the Religious Foundations of Northumberland, which I will now read to you. Hear you this, now. Abbey of Forestburne. It is well known that the altar vessels, plate, and jewels of this house were considerable in number and in value, but were never handed over to the custodians of the King's Treasury House in London. They were duly inventoried by the receivers in these parts, and there are letters extant recording their dispatch to London, but they never reached their destination, and it is commonly believed that, like a great deal more of the monastic property of the northern districts, these valuables were appropriated by high-placed persons of the neighbourhood, who employed their underlings, marked and disguised, to waylay and despoil the messengers entrusted to carry them southward. N.B. These foregoing remarks apply to the plate and jewels which appertain to the adjacent priory of Mellerton, which were also of great value. So, continued Mr. Cazalette, there's no doubt, in my mind anyway, that the plate of which Middlebrook saw the inventories is just what they describe it to be, and that it came, in course of time, into the hands of the Lord Forestburne, who deposited it in yon bank. And now, he went on, opening the biggest of his volumes, here's the file of a local paper which your respected predecessor, Mr. Raven, had the good sense to keep, and I've turned up the account of the inquest that was held at Blyth on yon dishonest bank manager. And there's a bit of evidence here that nobody seems to have drawn Scarterfield's attention to. The deceased gentleman, it reads, was very fond of the sea, and frequently made excursions along our beautiful coast in a small yacht which he hired from Messrs. Capsticks, the well-known boat builders of the town. It will be remembered that he had a particular liking for night sailing, and would often sail his yacht out of harbour late of an evening, in order, as he said, to enjoy the wonderful effects of moonlight on sea and coast. That, you'll bear in mind, concluded Mr. Cazalette, with a more than usually sardonic grin, was penned by some fatuous reporter before they knew that the deceased gentleman had robbed the bank. And no doubt it was on those night excursions that he and this man Baxter that we've heard of carried away the stolen valuables and safely hid them in some quiet spot on this coast. And there, you'll see, they'll be found all in good time. And as sure as my name is what it is, Dr. Lorrimore, it was that spot that Salter Quick was after, only he wasn't exactly certain where it was, and had somehow got mixed about the graves of the Netherfields. Man alive! Yon plate of the old monk's is buried under some Netherfield headstone at this minute." "Don't believe it, sir," said Lorrimore. "It's much more likely to be stored in some handy seaport where it can be easily called for without attracting attention. And if Middlebrook'll give me Scarterfield's address, that's what I'm going to suggest to him." I suppose Lorrimore wrote to the detective, but during the next few days I heard nothing from Scarterfield. Indeed, nobody heard anything new from anywhere. I believe that Scarterfield from Blyth gave some hints to the coastguard people about keeping a lookout for the Blanchflower, but I am not sure of it. However, two of us at Ravensdene Court took a mutual liking for walks along the loneliest stretches of the coast myself and Miss Raven. Before my journey to Blyth and Hull, she and I had already taken to going for afternoon excursions together. Now we lengthened them, going out after lunch, and remaining away until we had only just time to return home by the dinner hour. I think we had some vague idea that we might possibly discover something, perhaps find some trace, we knew not of what. Then we were led unexpectedly, as such things always do happen, to the threshold of our great and perilous adventure. Going further afield than usual one day, and, about 5 o'clock of a spring afternoon, straying into a solitary ravine that opened up before us on the moors that stretched to the very edge of the coast, we came upon an ancient wood of dwarf oak, so venerable and time-worn in appearance that it looked like a survival of the Druid age. There was not an opening to be seen in its thick undergrowth, nor any sign of path or track through it, but it was with a mutual consent and understanding that we made our way into its intense silence. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Ravensdene Court by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Humphrey de Nathville. In order to arrive at a proper understanding of the peculiar circumstances and position in which Miss Raven and myself very shortly found ourselves placed, it is necessary to give some information as to the geographical situation of the wood into which we plunged, more, I think, out of a mingled feeling of curiosity and mystery than of anything else. We had then walked several miles from Ravensdene Court in a northerly direction, but instead of keeping to the direct line of the cliffs and headlands, we had followed an inland track along the moors, which, however, was never at any point of its tortuous way more than a mile from the coast. The last mile or two of this had been through absolute solitudes, save for a lonely farmstead or shepherd's cottage, seen far off on the rising ground, further inland. We had not seen a sign of human habitation. Nor that afternoon did we see any sail on the broad stretch of sea at our right, nor even the smoke trail of any passing steamer on the horizon. Yet the place we now approached seemed even more solitary. We came to a sort of ravine, a deep fissure in the line of the land, on the south side of which lay the wood of ancient oak of which I have spoken. Beyond it, on the northern side, the further edge of this ravine rose steeply, masses of scarred limestone jutting out of its escarpments. It seemed to me that at the foot of the wood, and in the deepest part of this natural declension, there would be a burn, a stream, that ran downwards from the moor to the sea. I think we had some idea of getting down to this, following its course to the outlet on the beach, and returning homeward by way of the sands. The wood into which we made our way was well nigh impregnable. It seemed to me that for age upon age its undergrowth had run riot, untrimmed, unchecked, until at last it had become a matted growth of interwoven, strangely twisted boughs and tendrils. It was only by turning in first one, then another direction through it that we made any progress in the downward direction we desired. Sometimes it was a matter of forcing one's way between the thickly twisted obstacles. We exchanged laughing remarks about our having found the forest primeval. Before long each was plentifully adorned with scratches and tears. All around us the silence was intense. There was no singing of birds nor humming of insects in that wood. But more than once we came across bones, the whitened skeletons of animals that had sought these shades and died there, or had been dragged into them and torn to pieces by their fellow beasts. Altogether there was an atmosphere of eeriness and gloom in that wood, and I began, more for my companion's sake than my own, to long for a glimpse of some outlet, a sight of the sunlit sea beyond, and for the murmur of the burn which I felt sure ran rippling coastwards beneath the fringes of this almost impassable thicket. And then, at the end of quite half an hour's struggling, borne, I must say, by Miss Raven with the truly sporting spirit which was a part of her general character, a sudden exclamation from her as she pushed her way through a clump of wilding a little in advance of me, caused me to look ahead. "There's some building just in front of us," she said. "See? Grey stones, a ruin." I looked in the direction she indicated, and through the interstices of the thickly leaved branches, just then prodigal of their first spring foliage, saw, as she said, a grey wall, venerable and time-stained, rising in front. I could see the topmost stones, a sort of broken parapet, ivy clustering about it, and beneath the green of the ivy, a fragment of some ornamentation and the cavernous gloom of a window-place from which glass and tracery had long since gone. "That's something to make for, anyway," I said. "Some old tower or other. Yet I don't remember anything of the sort marked on the maps." We pushed forward and came out on a little clearing. Immediately in front of us stood the masonry of which we had caught glimpses. A low, squat, square tower, some 40 feet in height, ruinous as to the most part, but having the side facing us nearly perfect, and still boasting a fine old doorway which I set down as of Norman architecture. North of this lay a mass of fallen masonry, a long line of grass-grown, weed-encumbered stone, which was evidently the ruin of a wall. Here and there in the clearing were similar smaller masses. Rank weed, bramble bush, beds of nettles, encumbered the whole place. It was a scene of ruin and desolation. But a mere glance was sufficient to show me that we had come by accident on a once sacred spot. "Why, this," said I, as we paused at the edge of the wood, "this is the ruin of some ancient church, or perhaps of a religious house. Look at the niche there above the arch of the door. There's been an image in that. And at the general run of the stone lying about. Certainly this is an old church. Why have we never heard of it?" "Utterly forgotten, I should think," said Miss Raven. "It must be a long time since there were people about here to come to it." "Probably a village down on the coast, now swept away," I remarked. "But we must look this place out in the local books. Meanwhile, let's explore it." We began to look about the clearing. The tower was almost gone as to 3 sides of it. The fourth was fairly intact. A line of fallen masonry lay to the north, and was continued a little on the east, where it rose into a higher, ivy-covered mass. With this again was another, less obvious line, similar in plan, and also covered with unchecked growth. Within that the uneven surface of the ground was thickly encumbered with rank weeds, beds of thistle, beds of nettle, and a plenitude of bramble and gorse. In one place towards the eastern mass of overgrown wall, a great clump of gorse had grown to such a height and thickness as to form an impenetrable screen. And peering and prying about, suddenly we came, between this screen and the foot of the tower, on signs of great slabs of stone, over the edges of which the coarse grass had grown, and whose surfaces were thickly encovered with moss and lichen. "Gravestones," said Miss Raven, "but I suppose they're quite worn and illegible." I sat down on my knees at one of the slabs, less encumbered than the others, and began to tear away the grass and weed. There was a rich, thick carpet of moss on it, and a fringe of grey, clinging lichen, but by the aid of a stout pocket knife I forced it away, and laid bare a considerable surface of the upper half of the stone. And now that the moss, which had formed a sort of protecting cover, was removed, we saw lettering, worn and smoothed at its edges in common with the rest of the slab, but still to be made out with a little patience. There may be, probably is, a certain density in me, a slowness of intuition and perception, but it is the fact that at this time, and for some minutes later, I had not the faintest suspicion that we had accidentally lighted upon something connected with the mystery of Salter Quick. All I thought of, I think, just then, was that we had come across some old relic of antiquity, the church of some coast hamlet or village, which had long been left to the ruinous work of time, and my only immediate interest was in endeavouring to decipher the half worn out inscription on the stone by which I was kneeling. While my companion stood by me, watching with eager attention, I scraped out the earth and moss and lichen from the lettering. Fortunately, it had been deeply incised in the stone, a hard and durable sort, and much of it remained legible once the rubbish had been cleared from it. Hic jacet Dominus Humphrey de Nathville, quond vicari huius, eclie qui obeet, anno Dei MCCCCXIX. Beneath these lines were two or three others, presumably words of scripture, which had evidently become worn away before the moss spread its protecting carpet over the others. But we had learned something. "There we are," said I, regarding the result of my labours with proud satisfaction. "There it runs: 'Here lies the Lord, or Master, Humphrey de Nathville, sometime vicar of this church, who died in the year of our Lord 1419, nearly 600 years ago. A good find!'" "Splendid!" exclaimed Miss Raven, already excited to enthusiasm by these antiquarian discoveries. "I wonder if there are inscriptions on the other tombs?" "No doubt," I assented. "And perhaps some, or things of interest on this fallen masonry. This place is well worth careful examination, and I'm wondering how it is I haven't come across any reference to it in the local books. But to be sure, I haven't read them very fully or carefully. Mr. Cazalet may know of it. We shall have something to tell him." We began to look round again. I wandered into the base of the tower. Miss Raven began to explore the weed-choked ground towards the east end. Suddenly I heard a sharp, startled exclamation from her. Turning, I saw her standing by the great clump of overgrown gorse of which I have already spoken. She glanced at me, then at something behind the gorse. "What is it?" I asked. Unconsciously she lowered her voice, at the same time glancing half nervously at the thick undergrowth of the wood. "Come here," she said. "Come!" I went across the weed-grown surface to her side. She pointed behind the gorse bush. "Look there!" she whispered. I knew, as soon as I looked, that we were not alone in that wild, solitary-seeming spot, that there were human ears listening and human eyes watching, that we were probably in danger. There, behind the yellow-starred clump of green, was what at first sight appeared to be a newly opened grave, but was in reality a freshly dug excavation. A heap of soil and stone, just flung out, lay by it. On this some hand had flung down a mattock, near it rested a pick. And suddenly, as by a heaven-sent inspiration, I saw things. We had stumbled on the graveyard which Salter Quick had wished to find. Denathfield and Netherfield were identical terms which had got mixed up in his uneducated mind. Here the missing treasure was buried, and we had walked into this utterly deserted spot to interrupt what? And who? "Oh, I say!" she cried. "Who are these men?" Her hand moved instinctively towards my arm as she spoke, and as I drew it within my grasp I felt that she was trembling a little. And in that same instant, turning quickly in the direction she indicated, I became aware of the presence of two men who had quietly stepped out from the shelter of the high undergrowth on the landward side of the clearing, and stood silently watching us. They were attired in something of the fashion of seamen, in rough trousers and jerseys, but I saw at first glance that they were not common men. Indeed, I saw more, and realized with a sickening feeling of apprehension that our wandering into that place had brought us face to face with danger. One of the two, a tallish, slender-built, good-looking man, not at all unpleasant to look on if it had not been for a certain sinister and cold expression of eye and mouth, I recognized as a stranger whom I had noticed at the coroner's inquest on Salter Quick, and had then taken for some gentleman of the neighbourhood. The other, I felt sure, was Netherfield Baxter. There was the golden brown beard of which Fish had told me, and Scarterfield. There, too, was the half-hidden scar on the left cheek. I had no doubt whatever that Miss Raven and myself were in the hands of the two men who had bought the Blanchflower from Jallanby, the shipbroker of Hull. The four of us stood steadily gazing at each other for what seemed to be a long, and to me a painful minute. Then the man, whom I took to be Baxter, moved a little nearer to us. His companion, hands in pockets but watchful enough, lounged after him. "Well, sir," said Baxter, lifting his cap as he glanced at Miss Raven, "don't think me too abrupt, nor intentionally rude, if I ask you what you and this young lady are doing here?" His voice was that of a man of education and even of refinement, and his tone polite enough. There was something of apology in it. But it was also sharp, businesslike, compelling. I saw at once that this was a man whose character was essentially matter of fact, and who would not allow himself to stick at trifles, and I judged it best to be plain in my answer. "If you really want to know," I replied, "we are here by sheer accident. Exploring the wood for the mere fun of the thing, we chanced upon these ruins and have been examining them, that's all." "You didn't come here with any set purpose?" he asked, looking from one to the other. "You weren't seeking this place?" "Certainly not," said I. "We hadn't the faintest notion that such a place was to be found." "But here it is, anyway," he said. "And there you are. In the possession of the knowledge of it. And so, you'll excuse me, I must ask a question. Who are you? Tourists? Or do you live hereabouts?" The other man made a remark under his breath in some foreign language, eyeing me the while. And Baxter spoke again, watching me. "I think you, at any rate, are a resident," he said. "My friend has seen you before in these parts." "I have seen him," I said unthinkingly. "I saw him amongst the people at Salter Quick's inquest." The faintest shadow of an understanding glance passed between the two men, and Baxter's face grew stern. "Just so," he remarked. "That makes it all the more necessary to repeat my question. Who are you both?" "My name is Middlebrook, if you must know," I answered, "and I am not a resident of these parts. I am visiting here. As for this lady, she is Miss Raven, the niece of Mr. Francis Raven, of Ravensdene Court. And really—" He waved his hand, as if to deprecate any remonstrance or threat on my part, and bowed as politely to my companion as if I had just given him a formal introduction to her. "No harm shall come to you, Miss Raven," he said, with evidently honest assurance. "None whatever." "Nor to Mr. Middlebrook either, I should hope!" exclaimed Miss Raven, almost indignantly. He smiled, showing a set of very white, strong teeth. "That depends on Mr. Middlebrook," he said. "If Mr. Middlebrook behaves like a good and reasonable boy. Mr. Middlebrook," he went on, interrupting himself, and turning on me with a direct look, "a plain question. Are you armed?" "Armed?" I retorted scornfully. "Do you think I carry a revolver on an innocent country stroll?" "We do," he answered with another smile. "You see, we don't know with whom we may meet. It was 1,000,000 to 1, perhaps more, against our meeting anybody this afternoon, yet we've met you." "We are sorry to have interrupted you," I said, not without a touch of satirical meaning. "We won't interrupt any longer if you will permit us to say good bye." I mentioned to Miss Raven to follow me, and made to move, but Baxter laughed a little and shook his head. "I'm not sure that we can allow that just yet," he said. "It is unfortunate. I offer 1,000 apologies to Miss Raven, but business is business, and " "Do you mean to tell me that you intend to interfere with our movements just because you chanced to find us here?" I demanded. "If so " "Don't let us quarrel or get excited," he said, with another wave of his hand. "I have said that no harm shall come to you. A little temporary inconvenience, perhaps, but however, excuse me for a moment." He stepped back to his companion. Together they began to whisper, occasionally glancing at us. "What does he mean?" murmured Miss Raven. "Do they want to keep us here?" "I don't know what they intend," I said, "but don't be afraid." "I'm not afraid," she answered. "Only I've a pretty good idea of who it is that we've come across, and so have you." "Yes," I replied. "Unfortunately, I have. And we're at their mercy. There's nothing for it but to obey, I think." Baxter suddenly turned back to us. It was clear that his mind was made up. "Miss Raven, Mr. Middlebrook," he said, "I'm sorry, but we can't let you go. The fact is, you've had the bad luck to light on a certain affair of ours about which we can't take any chances. We have a yacht lying outside here. You'll have to go with us on board and remain there for a day or two. I assure you no harm shall come to either of you. And, as we want to get on with our work here, will you please to come now?" We went silently. There was nothing else to do. In a similar silence they led us through the rest of the wood, along the side of the stream which I had expected to find there, and to a small boat that lay hidden by the mouth of the creek. As they rowed us away in it, and rounded a spit of land, we saw the yacht lying under a bluff of the cliffs. 10 minutes' stiff pulling brought us alongside, and for a moment, as I glanced up at her rail, I saw the yellow face of a Chinaman looking down on us. Then it vanished. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Ravensdene Court by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Plum Cake. In the few moments which elapsed between my catching sight of that yellow face peering at us from the rail and our setting foot on the deck of what was virtually a temporary prison, I had time to arrive at a fairly conclusive estimate of our situation. Without doubt we were in the hands of Netherfield Baxter and his gang. Without doubt this was the craft which they had bought from the Hull shipbroker. Without doubt the reason of its presence on this lonely stretch of the coast lay in the proceedings amongst the ruins beneath whose walls we had come face to face with our captors. I saw, or believed that I saw, through the whole thing. Baxter and his accomplices had bought the yawl ostensibly for a trip to the Norwegian fjords, but in reality that they might sail it up the coast in the capacity of private yachtsmen, recover the treasure which had been buried near the tombs of the de Knaythvilles, and then go elsewhere. Miss Raven and I had broken in upon their operations, and we were to pay for the accident with our liberty. I was not concerned about myself. I fancied that I saw a certain amount of honesty in Baxter's assurances, but I was anxious about my companion and about her uncle's anxiety. Miss Raven was not the sort of girl to be easily frightened, but the situation, after all, was far from pleasant. There we were, defenceless, amongst men who were engaged in a dark and desperate adventure, whose hands were probably far from clean in the matter of murder, and who, if need arose, would doubtless pay small regard to our well-being or safety. Yet there was nothing else for it but to accept the situation. We went on deck. The vessel was at anchor. She lay, a thing of idleness, quiet and peaceful enough in a sheltered cove, wherein, I saw at a glance, she was lost to sight from the open sea outside the bar at its entrance, and hid from all but the actual coastline of the land. And all was quiet on her clean, freshly scoured decks. She looked, seen at close quarters, just what her possessors, of course, desired her to be taken for: a gentleman's pleasure yacht, the crew of which had nothing to do but keep her smart and bright. No one stepping aboard her would have suspected piracy or nefarious doings. And when we boarded her there was nobody visible. The Chinaman whom I had seen looking over the side had disappeared, and from stem to stern there was not a sign of human life. But as Miss Raven and I stood side by side, glancing about us with curiosity, a homely-looking grey cat came rubbing its shoulder against the woodwork, and from somewhere forward, where a wisp of blue smoke escaped from the chimney of the cook's galley, we caught a whiff of a familiar sort. Somebody, somewhere, was toasting bread and tea-cakes. We stood idle, like prisoners awaiting orders, while our captors transferred from the boat to the yawl 2 biggish iron-hooped chests, the wood of which was stained and discoloured with earth and clay. They were heavy chests, and they used tackle to get them aboard, setting them down close by where we stood. I looked at them with a good deal of interest. Then, remembering that Miss Raven was fully conversant with all that Scarterfield had discovered at Blyth, I touched her elbow, directing her attention to the 2 bulky objects before us. "Those are the chests that disappeared from the bank at Blyth," I whispered. "Now you understand?" She gave me a quick, comprehending look. "Then we are in the hands of Netherfield Baxter," she murmured. "That man there?" "Without a doubt," I answered. "And the thing is, show no fear." "I'm not a scrap afraid," she answered. "It's exciting. And he's rather interesting, isn't he?" "Gentlemen of his kidney usually are, I believe," I replied. "All the same, I should much prefer his room to his company." Baxter just then came over to us, rubbing from his fingers the soil which had gathered on them from handling the chests. He smiled politely, with something of the air of a host who wants to apologize for the only accommodation he can offer. "Now, Miss Raven," he said, with an accent of almost benevolent indulgence, "as we shall be obliged to inflict our hospitality upon you for a day or 2, I hope it won't be for longer, for your sake, let me show you what we can give you in the way of quarters to yourself. We can't offer you the services of a maid, but there is a good cabin, well fitted, in which you'll be comfortable, and you can regard it as your own domain while you're with us. Come this way." He led us down a short gangway, across a sort of small saloon evidently used as a common room by himself and his companion, and threw open the door of a neat, though very small cabin. "Never been used," he said with another smile. "Fitted up by the previous owner of this craft, and all in order, as you see. Consider it as your own, Miss Raven, while you're our guest. One of my men shall see that you've whatever you need in the way of towels, hot water, and the like. If you'll step in and look round, I'll send him to you now. As he's a Chinaman, you'll find him as handy as a French maid. Give him any orders or instructions you like. And then come on deck again, if you please, and you shall have some tea." He beckoned me to follow him as Miss Raven walked into her quarters, and he gave me a reassuring look as we crossed the outer cabin. "She'll be perfectly safe and secluded in there," he said. "You can mount guard here if you like, Mr. Middlebrook. In fact, this is the only place I can offer you for quarters for yourself. I dare say you could manage to make a night's rest on one of these lounges, with the help of some rugs and cushions, and we've plenty of both." "I'm all right, thank you," said I. "Don't trouble about me. My only concern is about Miss Raven." "I'll take good care that Miss Raven is safe in everything," he answered. "As safe as if she were in her uncle's house. So don't bother your head on that score. I've given my word." "I don't doubt it," I said. "But as regards her uncle, I want to speak to you about him." "A moment," he replied. "Excuse me." We were on deck again, and he went forward, poked his head into an open hatchway, and gave some order to an unseen person. A moment later a Chinaman, the same whose face I had seen as we came aboard, shot out of the hatchway, glided past me as he crossed the deck with silent tread, and vanished into the cabin we had just left. Baxter came back to me, pulling out a cigarette case. "Yes?" he said, offering it. "About Mr. Raven?" "Mr. Raven," said I, "will be in great anxiety about his niece. She is the only relative he has, I believe, and he will be extremely anxious if she does not return this evening. He is a nervous, highly strung man." He interrupted me with a wave of his cigarette. "I've thought of all that," he said. "Mr. Raven shall not be kept in anxiety. As a matter of fact, my friend, whom you met with me up there at the ruins, is going ashore again in a few minutes. He will go straight to the nearest telegraph office, which is a mile or two inland, and there he will send a wire to Mr. Raven from you. Mr. Raven will get it by, say, 7 o'clock. The thing is, how will you word it?" We looked at each other. In that exchange of glances I could see that he was a man who was quick at appreciating difficulties, and he saw the peculiar niceties of the present one. "That's a pretty stiff question," said I. "Just so," he agreed. "It is. So take my advice. Instead of having the wire sent from the nearest office, do this. My friend, as a matter of fact, is going on by rail to Berwick. Let him send a wire from there. It will only mean that Mr. Raven will get it an hour or so later. Say that you and Miss Raven find you cannot get home tonight, and that she is quite safe. Word it in any reassuring way you like." I gave him a keen glance. "The thing is," said I, "can we get home tomorrow?" "Well, possibly tomorrow night late," he answered. "I will do my best. I hope to be through with my business tomorrow afternoon. Then " At that moment the other man appeared on deck, emerging from somewhere. He had changed his clothes. He now presented himself in a smart tweed suit, Homburg hat, polished shoes, gloves, walking cane. Baxter signed to him to wait, turning to me. "That's the wisest thing to do," he remarked. "Draft your wire." I wrote out a message which I hoped would allay Mr. Raven's anxieties, and handed it to him. He read it over, nodded as if in approbation, and went across to the other man. For a moment or two they stood talking in low tones. Then the other man went over the side, dropped into the boat which lay there, and pulled himself off shorewards. Baxter came back to me. "He'll send that from Berwick railway station as soon as he gets there at 6:30, he said. "It should be delivered at Ravensdene Court by 8. So there's no need to worry further, you can tell Miss Raven. And when all's said and done, Mr. Middlebrook, it wasn't my fault that you and she broke in upon very private doings up there in the old churchyard. Nor, I suppose, yours either. Make the best of it. It's only a temporary detention." I was watching him closely as he talked, and suddenly I made up my mind to speak out. It might be foolish, even dangerous, to do it, but I had an intuitive feeling that it would be neither. "I believe," I said brusquely enough, "that I am speaking to Mr. Netherfield Baxter?" He returned me a sharp glance which was half smiling. Certainly there was no astonishment in it. "Aye," he answered. "I thought somehow that you might be thinking that. Well, and suppose I admitted Mr. Middlebrook? What then? And what do you, a Londoner, I think you told me, know of Netherfield Baxter?" "You wish to know?" I asked. "Shall I be plain?" "As a pikestaff, if you like," he replied. "I prefer it." "Well," said I, "a good many things recently discovered by accident. That you formerly lived at Blyth and had some association with a certain temporary bank manager there, about whose death and the disappearance of some valuable portable property there was a good deal of concern manifested about the time you left Blyth. That you were never heard of again until recently, when a Blyth man recognized you in Hull, where you bought a yawl this yawl, I believe and said you were going to Norway in her. And that but am I to be still more explicit?" "Why not?" said he with a laugh. "Forewarned is forearmed. You're giving me valuable information." "Very well, Mr. Baxter," I continued, determined to show him my cards. "There's a certain detective, one Scarterfield, a sharp man, who is very anxious to make your acquaintance. For if you want the plain truth, he believes you, or some of your accomplices, or you and they together, to have had a hand in the murders of Noah and Salter Quick. And he's on your track." I was watching him still more closely as I spoke the last sentence or two. He remained as calm and cool as ever, and I was somewhat taken aback by the collected fashion in which he not only replied to my glance, but answered my words. "Scarterfield, of whose doings I've heard a bit, has got hold of the wrong end of the stick there, Mr. Middlebrook," he said quietly. "I had no hand in murdering either Noah Quick or his brother Salter. Nor had my friend, the man who's just gone off with your telegram. I don't know who murdered those men, but I know that there have always been men who were ready to murder them if they got the chance, and I wasn't the least surprised to hear that they had been murdered. The wonder is that they escaped murder as long as they did. But beyond the fact that they were murdered, I know nothing, nor does anybody on board this craft. You and Miss Raven are amongst well, you can call us pirates if you like, buccaneers, adventurers, anything, but we're not murderers. We know nothing whatever about the murders of Noah and Salter Quick, except what we've read in the papers." I believed him, and I made haste to say so, out of a sheer relief to know that Miss Raven was not amongst men whose hands were stained with blood. "Thank you," he said, as coolly as ever. "I'm obliged to you. I have been anxious enough to know who did murder those two men. As I say, I felt no surprise when I heard of the murders." "You knew them the Quicks?" I suggested. "Did I?" he answered with a cynical laugh. "Didn't I? They were a couple of rank bad 'uns. I've never professed sanctity, Mr. Middlebrook, but Noah and Salter Quick were of a brand that's far beyond me. They were bad men. I'll tell you more of 'em later. Here's Miss Raven." "I may as well tell you," I murmured hastily, "that Miss Raven knows as much as I do about all that I've just told you." "That so?" he said. And she looks a sensible sort of lass, too. Well, I'll tell you both what I know, as I say, later. But now, some tea." While he went forward to give his orders, I contrived to inform Miss Raven of the gist of our recent conversation, and to assert my own private belief in Baxter's innocence. I saw she was already prejudiced in his favour. "I'm glad to know that," she said. "But in that case, the mystery's all the deeper. What is it, I wonder, that he can tell?" "Wait till he speaks," said I. "We shall learn something." Baxter came back, presently followed by the little Chinaman whom I had seen before, who deftly set up a small table on deck, drew chairs round it, and a few minutes later spread out all the necessaries of a dainty afternoon tea. And in the centre of them was a plum cake. I saw Miss Raven glance at it. I glanced at her. I knew of what she was thinking. Her thoughts had flown to the plum cake at Lorrimo's, made by Wing, his Chinese servant. But whatever we thought, we said nothing. The situation was romantic, and not without some attraction, even in those curious circumstances. Here we were, prisoners, first-class prisoners, if you will, but still prisoners, and there was our jailer. He and ourselves sat round a tea-table, munching toast, nibbling cakes and dainties, sipping fragrant tea, as if we had been in any lady's drawing-room. I think it speaks well for all of us that we realized the situation and made the most of it by affecting to ignore the actual reality. We chatted, as well-behaved people should under similar conditions, about anything but the prime fact of our imprisonment. Baxter, indeed, might have been our very polite and attentive host, and we his willing guests. As for Miss Raven, she accepted the whole thing with hearty good humour, and poured out the tea as if she had been familiar with our new quarters for many a long day. Moreover, she adopted a friendly attitude towards our captors, which did much towards smoothing any present difficulties. "You seem to be very well accommodated in the matter of servants, Mr. Baxter," she observed. "That little Chinaman, as you said, is as good as a French maid, and you certainly have a good cook. Excellent pastry cook, anyway." Baxter glanced lazily in the direction of the galley. "Another Chinaman," he answered. He looked significantly at me. "Mr. Middlebrook," he continued, "is aware that I bought this yawl from a shipbroker in Hull for a special purpose." "Not aware of the special purpose," I interrupted, with a purposely sly glance at him. "The special purpose is a run across the Atlantic, if you want to know," he answered carelessly. "Of course, when I got her, I wanted a small crew. Now, I've had great experience of Chinamen best servants on earth, in my opinion so I sailed her down to the Thames, went up to the London docks, and took in some Chinese chaps that I got in Limehouse. 2 men and 1 cook man cook, of course. He's good. I can't promise you a real and proper dinner to-night, but I can promise a very satisfactory substitute which we call supper." "And you're going across the Atlantic with a crew of 3?" I asked. "As a matter of fact," he answered candidly, "there are 6 of us. The 3 Chinese, myself, my friend who was with me this afternoon and who will join us again to-morrow, and another friend who will return with him, and who, like the crew, is a Chinaman. But he's a Chinaman of rank and position." "In other words, the Chinese gentleman who was with you and your French friend in Hull?" I suggested. "Just so, since we're to be frank," he answered. "The same." Then, with a laugh, he glanced at Miss Raven. "Mr. Middlebrook," he said, "considers me the most candid desperado he ever met." "Your candour is certainly interesting," replied Miss Raven, "especially if you really are a desperado. Perhaps you'll give us more of it?" "I'll tell you a bit later on," he said. "That Quick business, I mean." Suddenly, setting down his teacup, he got up and moved away towards the galley, into which he presently disappeared. Miss Raven turned sharply on me. "Did you eat a slice of that plum cake?" she whispered. "You did?" "I know what you're thinking," I answered. "It reminds you of the cake that Lorrimore's man, Wing, makes." "Reminds!" she exclaimed. "There's no reminding about it. Do you know what I think? That man Wing is aboard this yacht. He made that cake." Chapter 19. A Ravensdene Court by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Black Memories. There was so much of real importance, not only to us in our present situation, but to the trend of things in general, in Miss Raven's confident suggestion that her words immediately plunged me into a thoughtful silence. Rising from my chair at the tea-table, I walked across to the landward side of the yawl and stood there, reflecting. But it needed little reflection to convince me that what my fellow prisoner had just suggested was well within the bounds of possibility. I recalled all that we knew of the recent movements of Dr. Lorrimer's Chinese servant. Wing had gone to London on the pretext of finding out something about that other problematical Chinese, Lo Chuan Fen. Since his departure, Lorrimore had had no tidings of him and his doings. In Lorrimore's opinion, he might still be in London, or he might have gone to Liverpool or to Cardiff, to any port where his fellow countrymen are to be found in England. Now it was well within probabilities that Wing, being in Limehouse or Poplar, and in touch with Chinese sailormen, should, with others, have taken service with Baxter and his accomplice, and at that very moment there, in that sheltered cove on the Northumbrian coast, be within a few yards of Miss Raven and myself, separated from us by a certain amount of deck planking and a few bulkheads. But why? If he was there, in that yawl, in what capacity, real capacity, was he there? Ostensibly as cook, no doubt, but that, I felt sure, would be a mere blind. Put plainly, if he was there, what game was that bland, suave, obsequious, soft-tongued Chinaman playing? Was this his way of finding out what all of us wanted to know? If it came to it, if there was occasion, such occasion as I dared not contemplate, could Miss Raven and myself count on Wing as a friend? Or should we find him an adherent of the strange and curious gang which, if the truth was to be faced, literally held not only our liberty but our lives at its disposal? For we were in a tight place, of that there was no doubt. Up to that moment I was not unfavourably impressed by Netherfield Baxter, and whether against my better judgment or not, I was rather more than inclined to believe him innocent of actual share or complicity in the murders of Noah and Salter Quick. But I could see that he was a queer mortal, odd even to eccentricity, vain, candid and frank because of his very vanity, given, I thought, to talking a good deal about himself and his doings, probably a megalomaniac. He might treat us well so long as things went well with him, but supposing any situation to arise in which our presence, nay, our very existence, became a danger to him and his plans, what then? He had a laughing lip and a twinkle of sardonic humour in his eye, but I fancied that the lip could settle into ruthless resolve if need be, and the eye become more stony than would be pleasant. And we were at his mercy, the mercy of a man whose accomplice might be of a worse kidney than himself, and whose satellites were yellow-skinned, slant-eyed Easterns, pirates to a man, and willing enough to slit a throat at the faintest sign from a master. As I stood there, leaning against the side, gloomily staring at the shore, which was so near yet so impossible of access, I reviewed a point which was of more importance to me than may be imagined, the point of our geographical situation. I have already said that the yawl lay at anchor in a sheltered cove. The position of that cove was peculiar. It was entered from seawards by an extremely narrow inlet, across the mouth of which stretched a bar. I could realise that much by watching the breakers rolling over it. It was plain to me, a landsman, that even a small vessel could only get in or out of the cove at high water. But once across the bar, and within the narrow entry, any vessel coming in from the open sea would find itself in a natural harbour of great advantages. The cove ran inland for a good mile, and was quite another mile in width. Its waters were deep, rising some 15 to 20 feet over a clear sandy bottom, and on all sides, right down to the bar at its entrance, it was sheltered by high cliffs, covered from the tops of their headlands to the thin pebbly stretches of shore at their feet by thick wood, mostly oak and beech. That the cove was known to the folk of that neighbourhood it was impossible to doubt, but I felt sure that any strange craft passing along the sea in front would never suspect its existence, so carefully had nature concealed the entrance on the landward side of the bar. And there were no signs within the cove itself that any of the shore folk ever used it. There was not a vestige of a human dwelling place to be discovered anywhere along its thickly wooded banks, no boat lay on its white beach, no fishing net was stretched out there to dry in the sun and wind, the entire stretch was desolate. And I knew that an equal desolation lay all over the land immediately behind the cove and its sheltering woods. That was about the loneliest part of a lonely coast. By that time I had become well acquainted with it. For some miles north and south of that exact spot There were no coast villages. There was nothing save an isolated farmstead set in deep ravines at wide distances. The only link with busier things lay in the railway. That, as I also knew, lay about 2 or 2½ miles inland. As far as I could recollect the map which lay in my pocket, but which I did not dare pull out, there was a small wayside station on this line, immediately beyond the woods, through which Miss Raven and I had unthinkingly wandered to our fate. From it, doubtless, the Frenchman, Baxter's accomplice, had taken train for Berwick, some 20 miles northward. Everything considered, Miss Raven and I were as securely trapped and as much at our captor's mercy as if we had been immured in a 20th century Bastille. I went back presently to the tea table and dropped into my deck chair again. Baxter was still away from us. As far as I could see, there was no one about. I gave her a look which was intended to suggest caution, but I spoke in a purposely affected tone of carelessness. "I shouldn't wonder if you are right in your suggestion," I said. "In that case, I think we should have a friend on board in case we need one." "But you don't anticipate any need?" she asked quickly. "I don't," said I. "So don't think I do." "What do you suppose is going to happen to us?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder at the open door of the galley, into which Baxter had vanished. "I think they'll detain us until they're ready to depart, and then they'll release us," I answered. "Our host, or jailer, or whatever you like to call him, is a queer chap. He'll probably make us give him our word of honour that we'll keep close tongues." "He could have done that without bringing us here," she remarked. "Ah, but he wanted to make sure," said I. "He's taking no risks. However, I'm sure he means no harm to us. Under other conditions, I shouldn't have objected to meeting him. He's a character." "Interesting, certainly," she agreed. "Do you think he really is a pirate?" "I don't think he'll have any objection to making that quite clear to us, if he is," I replied cynically. "I should say he'd be rather proud of it. But I think we shall hear a good deal of him before we get our freedom." I was right there. Baxter seemed almost wistfully anxious to talk with us. He behaved like a man who for a long time had small opportunity of conversation with the people he would like to converse with, and he kept us both talking as the afternoon faded into evening and the evening fell towards night. He was a good talker, too, and knew much of books and politics and of men, and could make shrewd remarks, tinged, it seemed to me, with a little cynicism that was more good-humoured than bitter. The time passed rapidly in this fashion. Supper time arrived. The meal, as good and substantial as any dinner, was served in the little saloon-like cabin by the soft-footed Chinaman who, other than Baxter, was the only living soul we had seen since the Frenchman went away in the boat. All through it Baxter kept up his ready flow of talk, while punctiliously observing his duties as host. Until then the topics had been of a general nature, such as one might have heard dealt with at any gentleman's table. But when supper was over and the Chinaman had left us alone, he turned on us with a queer, inquisitive smile. "You think me a strange fellow," he said. "Don't deny it. I am, and I don't mind who thinks it or who knows it." I made no reply beyond an acquiescent nod, but Miss Raven, who all through this adventure showed a coolness and resourcefulness which I can never sufficiently praise, looked steadily at him. "I think you must have seen and known some strange things," she said quietly. "Aye, and done some," he answered, with a laugh that had more of harshness in it than was usual with him. Then he glanced at me. "Mr. Middlebrook there, from what he told me this afternoon, knows a bit about me and my affairs," he said. "But not much. Sufficient to whet your curiosity, eh, Middlebrook?" "I confess I should like to know more," I replied. "I agree with Miss Raven. You must have seen a good deal of the queer side of life." There was some fine old claret on the table between us. He pushed the bottle over to me, motioning me to refill my glass. For a moment he sat, a cigar in the corner of his lips, his hands in the armholes of his waistcoat, silently reflecting. "What's really puzzling you this time," he said suddenly, "is that Quick affair. I know, because I've not only read the newspapers, but I've picked up a good deal of local gossip never mind how. I've heard a lot of your goings on at Ravensdene Court, and the suspicions and so on. And I knew the Quicks no man better at one time, and I'll tell you what I know. Not a nice story from any moral point of view, but though it's a story of rough men, there's nothing in it at all that need offend your ears, Miss Raven, nothing. It's just a story, an instance, of some of the things that happen to Ishmaels, outcasts like me." We made no answer, and he refilled his own glass, took a mouthful of its contents, and glancing from one to the other of us, went on. "You're both aware of my youthful career at Blyth?" he said. "You, Middlebrook, are, anyway, from what you told me this afternoon, and I gather that you put Miss Raven in possession of the facts. Well, I'll start out from there. When I made the acquaintance of that temporary bank manager chap. Mind you, I'd about come to the end of my tether at that time as regards money. I'd been pretty well fleeced by one or another, largely through carelessness, largely through sheer ignorance. I didn't lose all my money on the turf, Middlebrook, I can assure you. I was robbed by more than one worthy man of my native town legally, of course, bless 'em. And it was that, I think, turned me into the Ishmael I've been ever since. As men had robbed me, I thought it a fair thing to get a bit of my own back. Now that bank manager chap was one of those fellows who are born with predatory instincts. My impression of him, from what I recollect, is that he was a born thief. Anyway, he and I, getting pretty thick with each other, found out that we were just then actuated by similar ambitions. I from sheer necessity, he, as I tell you, from temperament. And to cut matters short, we determined to help ourselves out of certain things of value stored in that bank, and to clear out to far-off regions with what we got. We discovered that 2 chests deposited in the bank's vaults by old Lord Forestburne contained a quantity of simply invaluable monastic spoil, stolen by the good man's ancestors 4 centuries before. We determined to have that and to take it over to the United States, from where we knew we could realize immense sums on it from collectors with no questions asked. There were other matters, too, which were handy. We carefully removed the lot, brought them along the coast to this very cove, and interred them in those ruins where we 3 foregathered this afternoon." "And whence, I take it, you have just removed them to the deck above our heads?" I suggested. "Right, Middlebrook, quite right. They are there," he admitted with a laugh. "A grand collection, too. Chalices, patens, reliquaries, all manner of splendid mediaeval craftsmanship, and certainly other more modern things with them, all destined for the other side of the Atlantic, the market sure and safe and ready." "You think you'll get them there?" I asked. "I shall be more surprised than I ever was in my life if I don't," he answered readily, and with that note of dryness which one associates with certainty. "I'm a pretty cute hand at making and perfecting and carrying out a plan. Yes, sir, they'll be there in good time, and they'd have been there long since if it hadn't been for an accident which I couldn't foresee. The bank manager chap had the ill luck to break his neck. Now that put me in a fix. I knew that the abstraction of these things would soon be discovered, and though I'd exercised great care in covering up all trace of my own share in the affair, there was always a bare possibility of something coming out. So, knowing the stuff was safely planted and very unlikely to be disturbed, I cleared out and determined to wait a fitting opportunity of regaining possession of it. My notion at that time, I remember, was to get hold of some American millionaire collector who would give me facilities for taking up the stuff to be handed over to him. But I didn't find one, and for the time being I had to keep quiet. Inquiries, of course, were set afoot about the missing property, but fortunately I was not suspected. And if I had been, I shouldn't have been found, for I know how to disappear as cleverly as any man who ever found that convenient." He threw away the stump of his cigar, deliberately lighted another, and leaned across the table towards me in a more confidential manner. "Now we're coming to the more immediately interesting part of the story," he said. "All that I've told you is, as it were, ancient history. We'll get to more modern times, affairs of yesterday, so to speak. After I cleared out of Blyth, with a certain amount of money in my pocket, I knocked about the world a good deal, doing one thing and another. I've been in every continent and in more seaports than I can remember. I've taken a share in all sorts of queer transactions, from smuggling to slave trading. I've been rolling in money in January and shivering in rags in June. All that was far away, in strange quarters of the world, for I never struck this country again until comparatively recently. I could tell you enough to fill a dozen fat volumes, but we'll cut all that out and get on to a certain time, now some years ago, whereat, in Hong Kong, I and the man you saw me with this afternoon, who, if everybody had their own, is a genuine French nobleman, came across those two particular precious villains, the brothers Noah and Salter Quick." "Was that the first time of your meeting with them?" I asked. Now that he was evidently bent on telling me his story, I, on my part, was bent on getting out of him all that I could. "You'd never met them before anywhere?" "Never seen nor heard of them before," he answered. "We met in a certain house of call in Hong Kong, much frequented by Englishmen and Americans. We became friendly with them, we soon found out that they, like ourselves, were adventurers, would-be pirates, buccaneers, ready for any game. We found out, too, that they had money and could finance any desperate affair that was likely to pay handsomely. My friend and I, at that time, were also in funds. We had just had a very paying adventure in the Malay archipelago, a bit of illicit trading, and we had got to Hong Kong on the lookout for another opportunity. Once we had got thoroughly in with the Quicks, that was not long in coming. The Quicks were as sharp as their name, they knew the sort of men they wanted, and before long they took us into their confidence and told us what they were after and what they wanted us to do in collaboration with them. They wanted to get hold of a ship, and to use it for certain nefarious trading purposes in the China seas. They had a plan by which the lot of us could have made a lot of money. Needless to say, we were ready enough to go in with them. Already they had a scheme of getting a ship such as they particularly needed. There was at that time, lying at Hong Kong, a sort of tramp steamer, the Elizabeth Robinson, the skipper of which wanted a crew for a trip to Chemulpo up the Yellow Sea. Salter Quick got himself into the confidence and graces of this skipper, and offered to man his ship for him, and he packed her as far as he could, with his own brother Noah, myself, my French friend, and a certain Chinese cook of whom he knew, and who could be trusted, that is, to fall in whatever we wanted. "Am I right in supposing the name of the Chinese cook to have been Lo Chuh Fen?" I asked. "Quite right. Lo Chuh Fen was the man," answered Baxter. "A very handy man for anything, as you'll admit, for you've already seen him. He's the man who attended on Miss Raven and who served our supper." I came across him again in Limehouse recently, and took him into my service once more. "Very well, now you understand that there were 5 of us all in for the Quicks' plan, and the notion was that when we'd got safely out of Hong Kong, Salter, who had a particularly greasy and insinuating tongue, should get round certain others of the crew by means of promises helped out by actual cash bribes. That done, we were going to put the skipper, his mates, and such of the men as wouldn't fall in with us, in a boat with provisions and let them find their way wherever they liked while we went off with the steamer. That was the surface plan. My own belief is that if it had come to it, the 2 Quicks would have been quite ready to make skipper and men walk the plank, or to have settled them in any other way. Both Noah and Salter, for all their respectable appearance, were born out of their due time. They were admirably qualified to have been lieutenants to Paul Jones or any other 18th century pirate. But in this particular instance their schemes were all wrong. Whether it was the skipper of the Elizabeth Robinson, who was an American, and cuter than we fancied, got wind of something, or whether somebody spilt to him, I don't know, but the fact is that one fine morning when we were in the Yellow Sea, he and the rest of us set on the Quicks, my friend, myself and the Chinaman, bundled us into a boat and landed us on a miserable island to fend for ourselves. There we were, the 5 of us, a precious bad lot to be sure, marooned. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Ravensdene Court by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The possible reason. At that last word, spoken with an emphasis which showed that it awoke no very pleasant memories in the speaker, Miss Raven looked questioningly from one to the other of us. "Marooned?" she said. "What is that, exactly?" Baxter gave her an indulgent and me a knowing look. "I dare say Mr. Middlebrook can give you the exact etymological meaning of the word better than I can, Miss Raven," he answered. "But I can tell you what the thing means in actual practice. It means to put a man or men ashore, preferably on a desert island, leaving him or them to fend for himself or themselves as best he or they can. It may mean slow starvation; at best it means living on what you can pick up by your own ingenuity, on shellfish and that sort of thing, even on edible seaweed. Marooned? Yes, that was the only experience I ever had of that. It's all very well talking of it now as we sit here on a comfortable little vessel with a bottle of good wine before us, but at the time, ah!" "You'd a stiff time of it," I suggested. "Worse than you'd believe," he answered. "That old Yankee skipper was a vindictive chap, with method in him. He'd purposely gone off the beaten track to land us on that island, and he played his game so cleverly that not even the Quicks, who were as subtle as snakes, knew anything of his intentions until we were all marched over the side at the point of ugly-looking revolvers. If it hadn't been for that little Chinese whom you've just seen, we would have starved, for the island was little more than a reef of rock, rising to a sort of peak in its centre, worn-out volcano, I imagine, with nothing eatable on it in the way of flesh or fruit. But Chuh was a godsend. He was clever at fishing, and he showed us an edible seaweed out of which he made good eating, and he discovered a spring of water. Altogether, he kept us alive. All of which," he suddenly added, with a darkening look, "made the conduct of those 2 Quicks not merely inexcusable, but devilish." "What did they do?" I asked. "I'm coming to it," he said, "all in due order. We were on that island several weeks, and from the time we were flung unceremoniously upon its miserable shores to the day we left it, we never saw a sail nor a wisp of smoke from a steamer. And it may be that this, and our privations, made us still more birds of a feather than we were. Anyway, you, Middlebrook, know how men, thrown together in that way, will talk, nay, must talk unless they'd go mad, talk about themselves and their doings and so on. We all talked. We used to tell tales of our doubtful past as we huddled together under the rocks at nights, and some nice lurid stories there were, I can assure you. The Quicks had seen about as much of the doubtful and seamy side of seafaring life as men could, and all of us could contribute something. Also, the Quicks had money, safely stowed away in banks here and there. They used to curse their fate, left there apparently to die when they thought of it. And it was that, I think, that led me to tell, one night, about my adventure with the naughty bank manager at Blyth, and of the chests of old monastic treasure which I'd planted up here on the Northumbrian coast." "Ah!" I exclaimed. "So you told Noah and Salter Quick that?" "I told Noah and Salter Quick that," he replied slowly. "Yes, and I can now explain to you what Salter was after when he appeared in these parts. I read the newspaper accounts of the inquest and so on, and I saw through everything, and could have thrown a lot of light on things, only I wasn't going to. But it was this way. I told the Quicks all about the Blyth affair, The truth was, I didn't believe we should ever get away from that cursed island. But I told them in a fashion which evidently afterwards led to considerable puzzlement on their part. I told them that I buried the chests of old silver, wherein were the other valuables taken from the vaults of a bank, in a churchyard on this coast, close to the graves of my ancestors. I described the spot and the lie of the ruins pretty accurately. Now, where the Quicks, Salter at any rate, got puzzled and mixed, was over my use of the word ancestors. What I meant, but never said, was that I had planted the stuff near the graves of my maternal ancestors, the old de Knaythvilles, who were once great folk in these parts, and of whose name my own Christian name, Netherfield, is of course a corruption. But Salter Quick, to be sure, thought the graves would bear the name Netherfield, and when he came along this coast it was that name he was hunting for. Do you see?" "Then Salter Quick was after that treasure?" I said. "Of course he was," replied Baxter. "The wonder to me is that he and Noah hadn't been after it before. But they were men who had a good many irons in the fire, too many, and some of them far too hot, as it turned out, and I suppose they left this little affair until an opportune moment. Without a doubt, not so long after I'd told them the story, Salter Quick scratched inside the lid of his tobacco box a rough diagram of the place I'd mentioned, with the latitude and longitude approximately indicated. That's the box there's been so much fuss about, I read in the papers, and I'll tell you more about it in due process. But now, about that island and the Quicks, and how they and the rest of us got out of it. I told you that the centre of the island rose to a high peak, separating one coast from the other. Well, one day, when we'd been marooned for several weary weeks, and there didn't seem the least chance of rescue, I, my French friend, and the Chinaman crossed the shoulder of that peak and went along the other coast prospecting, more out of sheer desperation than in the hope of finding anything. We spent the next night on the other side of the island, and it was not until late on the following afternoon that we returned to our camp, if you can call that a camp which was nothing but a hole in the rocks. And we got back to find Noah and Salter Quick gone, and we knew how they had gone when the Chinaman's sharp eyes made out a sail vanishing over the horizon. Some Chinese fishing boat had made that island in our absence, and these two skunks had gone away in her and left us, their companions, to shift for ourselves. That's the sort the Quicks were. Those were the sort of tricks they'd play on their so-called friends. Do you wonder, either of you, that both Noah and Salter eventually got what they got?" We made no answer to that beyond perhaps a shake of our heads. Then Miss Raven spoke. "But you got away in the end," she suggested. "We got away in the end some time later, when we were about done for," assented Baxter. "And in the same way a Chinese fishing boat that came within hail. It landed us on the Jiangsu coast, and we had a pretty bad time of it before we made our way to Shanghai. From that port we worked our passage to Hong Kong. I had an idea that we might strike the Quicks there, or get news of them, but we heard nothing of those two villains, at any rate. But we did hear that the Elizabeth Robinson had never reached Chemulpo. She'd presumably gone down with all hands, and we were supposed, of course, to have gone down with her. We did nothing to disabuse anybody of the notion. Both I and my friend had money in Hong Kong, and we took it up and went off to Singapore. As for our Chinaman, Chu, he said farewell to us and vanished as soon as we got back to Hong Kong, and we never set eyes on him again until very recently, when I ran across him in a Chinese eating-house in Poplar." "From that meeting, I suppose, the more recent chapters of your story begin?" I suggested. "Or do they begin somewhat earlier?" "A little bit earlier," he said. "My friend and I came back to England a little before that, with money in our pockets we'd been very lucky in the East and with a friend of ours, a Chinese gentleman, mind you, we decided to go in for a little profitable work of another sort, and to start out by lifting my concealed belongings up here. So we bought this craft in Hull, then ran her down to the Thames, then, as I say, I came across Lo Chuan Fen and got his services and those of two other compatriots of his then in London, and here we are. You see how candid I am. Do you know why?" "It would be interesting to know, Mr. Baxter," said Miss Raven. "Please tell us." "Well," he said, with a queer deliberation, "some men in my position would have thought nothing about putting bullets through both of you when we met this afternoon you hit on our secret. But I'm not that sort. I treat you as what you are, a gentlewoman and a gentleman, and no harm whatever shall come to you. Therefore, I feel certain that all I've said and am saying to you will be treated as it ought to be by you. I dare say you think I'm an awful scoundrel, but I told you I was an Ishmael, and I certainly haven't got the slightest compunction about appropriating the stuff in those chests on deck. One of the forest birds stole it from the monks. Why shouldn't I steal it from his successor? It's as much mine as his, perhaps more so, for one of my ancestors, a certain Geoffrey de Knaytheville, was at one time Lord Abbot of the very house that the forest birds stole that stuff from. I reckon I've a prior claim, Middlebrook." "I should imagine," I answered guardedly, "that it would be very difficult for anybody to substantiate a claim to ecclesiastical property of that particular nature which disappeared in the 16th century. What is certain, however, is that you've got it. Take my advice, hand it over to the authorities." He looked at me in blank astonishment for a moment, then laughed as a man laughs who is suddenly confronted by a good joke. "Ha, ha, ha!" he let out at the top of his voice. "Good! You're a born humorist, friend Middlebrook." He pushed the claret nearer. "Fill your glass again! Hand it over to the authorities? Why, that would merit a full-page cartoon in the next number of Punch. Good! Good! But," he went on, suddenly becoming grave again, "we were talking of those scoundrelly Quicks. Of course we that is, my French friend and I have been and are suspected of murdering them?" "I think that is so," I answered. "Well, that's a very easy point to settle, if it should ever come to it," he replied, "and I'll settle it for your edification just now. Noah and Salter Quick were done to death, one near Saltash in Cornwall, the other near Alnwick in Northumberland, several hundreds of miles apart, about the same hour of the same evening. Now, my friend and I, so far from being anywhere near either Saltash or Alnwick on that particular evening and night, spent them together at the North Eastern Railway Hotel at York. I went there that afternoon from London, he joined me from Berwick. We met at the hotel about 6 o'clock, we dined in the hotel, we played billiards in the hotel, we slept in the hotel, we breakfasted in the hotel folks will remember us well, and our particulars are duly registered in their books on the date in question. We had no hand whatever in the murders of Noah and Salter Quick, and I give you my word of honour, being under the firm impression that though I am a pirate I am still a gentleman, that neither of us have the slightest notion who had." Miss Raven made an involuntary murmur of approval, and I was so much convinced of the man's good faith that I stretched out my hand to him. "Mr. Baxter," said I, "I'm heartily glad to have that assurance from you, and whether I'm a humorist or not, I beg you once more to take my advice and give up that loot to the authorities. You can make a plausible excuse, and throw all the blame on that bank manager fellow, and, take my word for it, little will be said, and then you can devote your undoubtedly great and able talents to legitimate ventures." "That would be dull as ditch-water, Middlebrook," he retorted with a grin. "You're tempting me. But those Quicks I'll tell you in what fashion there is a connection between their murder and ourselves, and one that would need some explanation. Bear in mind that I've kept myself posted in those murders through the newspapers, and also by collecting a certain amount of local gossip. Now, you've a certain somewhat fussy and garrulous old gentleman at Ravensdene Court—" "Mr. Cazalette!" exclaimed Miss Raven. "Mr. Cazalette is the name," said Baxter. "I have heard much of him, through the sources I've just referred to. Now, this Mr. Cazalette, going to or coming from a place where he bathed every morning, which place happened to be near the spot whereat Salter Quick was murdered, found a blood-stained handkerchief." "He did," said I, "and a lot of mystery attaches to it." "That handkerchief belongs to my French friend," said Baxter. "I told you that he joined me at York from Berwick. As a matter of fact, for some little time, just before the Salter Quick affair, he was down on this coast, posing as a tourist, but really just ascertaining if things were as I'd left them at the ruins in the wood above this cove, and what would be our best method of getting the chests of stuff away. For a week or so he lodged at an inn somewhere, I think near Ravensdene Court, and he used sometimes to go down to the shore for a swim. One morning he cut his foot on the pebbles, and staunched the blood with his handkerchief, which he carelessly threw away, and your Mr. Cazalette evidently found it. That's the explanation of that little matter. And now for the tobacco box." "A much more important point," said I. "Just so," agreed Baxter. "Now, my friend and I first heard of the murder while we were at York. In the newspapers that we read there was an account of a conversation which took place in, I believe, Mr. Raven's coach house, or some outbuilding, whither the dead man's body had been carried, between this old Mr. Cazalette and a police inspector, regarding a certain metal tobacco box found on Salter Quick's body. Now, I give you my word that that news was the first intimation we had ever had that the Quicks were in England. Until then we hadn't the slightest idea that they were in England, but we knew what those mysterious scratches on the tobacco box signified. Salter had made a rude plan of the place I had told him of, and was in Northumberland to search for it. Then later we read your evidence at the opening of the inquest, and heard what you had to tell about his quest of the Netherfield graves, and, just to satisfy ourselves, we determined to get hold of that tobacco box, for don't you see, as long as it was about, a possible clue, there was a danger of somebody discovering our buried chest of silver and valuables?" So my friend came down again in his tourist capacity, put up at the same quarters, strolled about, fished a bit, botanised a bit, attended the adjourned inquest as a casual spectator, and abstracted the tobacco box under the very noses of the police. "It's in that locker now," continued Baxter with a laugh, pointing to a corner of the cabin, "and with it are the handkerchief, your old friend Mr. Cazalette's pocket book." "Oh, your friend got that too, did he?" I exclaimed. "I see." "He abstracted that too, easily enough, one morning when the old fellow was bathing," assented Baxter. "Naturally, we weren't going to take any chances about our hidden goods being brought to light. We're highly indebted to Mr. Cazalette for making so much fuss about the tobacco box, and we're glad there was so much local gossip about it, eh?" I remained silent a while, reflecting. "It's a very fortunate thing for both of you that you could, if necessary, prove your presence at York on the night of the murder," I remarked at last. "Your doings about the tobacco box and the other things might otherwise wear a very suspicious look. As it is, I'm afraid the police would probably say, granted that they knew what you've just told us so frankly, that even if you and your French friend didn't murder Salter Quick and his brother, you were probably accessory to both murders. That's how it strikes me, anyway." "I think you're right," he said calmly. "Probably they would. But the police would be wrong. We were not accessory, either before or since. We haven't the ghost of a notion as to the identity of the Quicks' murderers. But since we're discussing that, I'll tell you both of something that seems to have completely escaped the notice of the police, the detectives, and of you yourself, Middlebrook. You remember that in both cases the clothing of the murdered men had been literally ripped to pieces?" "Very well," said I. "It had in Salter's, anyway, to my knowledge." "And so they said it had in Noah's," replied Baxter. "And the presumption, of course, was that the murderers were searching for something." "Of course," I said. "What other presumption could there be?" Baxter gave us both a keen, knowing look, bent across the table, and tapped my arm as if to arrest my attention. "How do you know that the murderers didn't find what they were seeking for?" he asked in a low, forceful voice. "Come, now!" I stared at him. So, too, did Miss Raven. He laughed. "That certainly doesn't seem to have struck anybody," he said. "I'm sure, anyway, it hasn't struck you before. Does it now?" "I'd never thought of it," I admitted. "Exactly! Nor, according to the papers and to my private information had anybody," he answered. "Yet it would have been the very first thought that would have occurred to me. I should have said to myself, seeing the ripped up clothing, 'Whoever murdered these men was in search of something that one or the other of the two had concealed on him, and the probability is he's got it.' Of course." "I'm sure nobody, police or detectives, ever did think of that," said I. "But perhaps with your knowledge of the Quicks' antecedents and queer doings, you have some knowledge of what they might be likely to carry about them." He laughed at that, and again leaned nearer us. "Aye, well," he replied, "as I've told you so much, I'll tell you something more. I do know of something that the two men had on them when they were on that miserable island, and that they, of course, carried away with them when they escaped. Noah and Salter Quick were then in possession of two magnificent rubies, worth no end of money." Chapter 21.